Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on Python programming. In an earlier video, you might have encountered and learned about the concept of while loops and how they work and how you can use them in different situations. So this video will be an extension to that topic where we will be looking at 3 examples where we are using while loops along with other stuff like say if and else statements. So our first example will be where we calculate the factorial of a number. In this example, as you can see here, we are first going to ask the user to enter a particular number for us. Now this number is supposed to be an integer. Once we have this integer, we store it to a variable called number. Now we have this, you can say this variable called FAC which stores 1, and we will see how we are using it later. Now we know that the factorial of 0 is 1. That's how it's just defined. So we have an if statement checking whether our entered number is 0, and if it is 0, we say that the result is 1 or the factorial is 1. However, if we enter a number that is greater than 0, we must calculate the factorial for this number, and that is what we are going to do in this else statement block over here. Now in this else statement block, we have a while loop. In this while loop, the condition is checking while number is greater than or equal to 1. So as long as this condition is true, everything within that while loop will be executed. So as long as number is greater than or equal to 1, we are going to execute these 2 lines. Now what do these 2 lines do? Let us see. So the first line takes the variable FAC where we had the number 1 stored, and we are going to store FAC times number into it, number being the number that we have inputted. So in case, for example, we entered 8, then what this line will do is 1 into 8, and it will store that back into FAC. Now once that is done, we move on to the next line where we are decrementing the number variable by 1. So if we have stored 8 or we have entered 8 into our input, it will become 7. Now as we know, 7 is still greater than or equal to 1, so this condition is still being met. And then we do this process again where we are going to multiply FAC. This time FAC stores the value 8, and we multiply it times the new number, which is 7 now. So we do 8 into 7, and then again we decrement this. Also once we do 8 into 7, we store it back into FAC. And we keep doing this where we keep multiplying 8 times 7, and then we decrement the number variable by 1, and then we check this condition again. So what ends up happening is we are going to keep doing 8 into 7 into 6 into 5 into 4 into 3 into 2 into 1. And once we are at 1, again when we do this decrement operation, the number variable will store the value 0, and then this condition will no longer be met. So number will be 0 and this condition will be false, and we can move out of this while loop. And then finally we store the result into a variable called result, which stores the result of 8 into 7 into 6 into 5 into 4 into 3 into 2 into 1. This is of course if we did enter 8 when we were asked to give an input. So let's see this in real time once we execute this. So I'm executing this. The first thing it asks me is to enter a number. So let's say I enter my number 8, as I was speaking about 8. Alright, now that I have entered 8, as you can see, the result that it gives me is factorial of 8 is 40320, which is correct, and you can check this for yourself where it will show you 8 times 7 or 8 factorial is basically this number. Okay, so now in our next example, we will be looking at how we can generate Fibonacci numbers. For this example, we will be using bunch of if and else if statements along with a while loop. So let's look at this piece of code where we are actually doing this. So as you can see, the first part of the code is basically an input statement asking us how many Fibonacci numbers we would like to generate. And then the user would be asked to give an input, which is stored as an int into a variable count. Now in this if-else statement, the first if statement checks whether what we have entered is 0, in which case we just store an empty array in the variable called fib. Next, if our entered integer is 1, we just store the value 1 in this array called fib. If our entered number is 2, we store 1 and 1 in the array fib. All of these are different sets of Fibonacci sequences. This obviously an empty array shows that, well, there is no numbers to be generated in this sequence. If we have 1, we just print the first number of the Fibonacci sequence, which is 1 itself. If it is 2, we print the first two numbers, which is 1 and 1. Now, the actual calculations happen when we say we want a Fibonacci sequence for more than 2 numbers. Now, in that case, we move on to this block. In this statement block, we initialize the fib variable with the first two Fibonacci numbers 1 and 1, and we store in this array. Now, we are going to do a while loop within this, and in this while loop, we're going to keep executing this statement block as long as this condition is met or this condition is true. And what this condition is it's checking this variable I, which we have initialized as 1 over here, and we're going to check whether that is lesser than count minus 1, count being the number that we have been asked to input. If the statement is true, and as long as this statement is true, we will be executing this statement block, which is basically us appending this expression into the array fib. Now what this expression is basically, it's going to keep adding each subsequent numbers, and we're going to store each subsequent numbers back into the array fib. So in this case, if you see, what the first step will do is it will take the value at the first position of the array fib, and it will add it to the value at the 0th position of the array fib. And both of these values, since they are 1 and 1, when we add them, we get 2, and we append that to fib. So now our fib will look like 1, 1, 2. Then we increment this by 1, and what we do is we do the same process again. So in the next step, what we would do is we would do 2 plus 1. So we would get 3. Now this would keep going on until this condition is met, or basically until the numbers that we actually want to generate in our sequence. So let's execute this, and let's see an example of what happens. So it asks me how many Fibonacci numbers I would like to generate, and I will say I want the first, let's say 6 Fibonacci numbers. So I execute this. As you can see, this gives me the first 6 numbers in the sequence, which is 1 and 1, and then 2, which is basically 1 plus 1, and then 3, which is 1 plus 2, and then 5, which is 2 plus 3, 8, which is 3 plus 5. So if we wanted more numbers, we would just enter over here. Like say if we wanted the first 10 numbers, it would give us the first 10 numbers in the sequence, as you can see here. Now in our next example, what we are going to do is we're going to write a program which takes 2 digits that represent the dimensions of an array. For example, if we want a 3 by 3 array, we will enter 3, 3, and we are going to generate a 2-dimensional array in which each of the elements of the array are basically the row times the column position of that particular element. And what I mean by this is, say we have a position I, j on the array. The value of the element at that position would be I times j. So for example, if I'm looking at something at the 3rd row and the 5th column, or say the 3rd row and the 3rd column, for example, the value of the element would be 3 times 3. And if I'm looking at something at the 2nd row and the 4th column, I am going to do 2 times 4. So let's see how we can do this using code. So if you look to the right over here, I have a piece of code where I'm going to where it asks me to input 2 numbers, 2 integers, to represent the dimensions of my my sample array. Now once we have done this, we are going to store these dimensions in the inputs in a variable called input string. So obviously when we enter say 5, 5, that will be stored as an int in this particular string or this variable. What we want is, we want 5, say we entered 5, 5, we want 5 as a separate integer and the other 5 as another separate integer. And that is what we do in this particular statement, where we're going to split up our input string based on the comma separator, and we're going to store the first part of that string into the 0th position of dimensions, which is an array, and the next dimension in the first position in this particular array. Now we're going to store the number of rows as row number, and that is the 0th position of this array, and we're going to store the number of columns as the first position of dimensions, or whatever we've mentioned in the input. So now we have this our results array called multi-list, which is basically what our final array is going to look like, and we're going to store into multi-list. And in this example, we will be using for loops to do this or to create this particular array. So as you can see here, our first, we have initialized our multilist saying that we're going to have only zeros in our sample array. So initially, once we have initialized this array, all multilist will contain is a, say for example, we have inputted a 5 by 5 array. It will have basically a 5 by 5 array with all elements as 0. And that's what this line does. Once we have done this, we are going to move on to the for loop portion where we are actually going to create our array that we want. So as you can see, our first for loop is going to say for row in range row number. So obviously range will generate an iterator which can be iterated over, and since it says range row number and say the number of rows that we entered were 5, what it's going to do is it's going to create an iterator containing the value 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. So for row and range, it will basically row will take the value 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. And a similar thing is going to happen in this nested for loop, which is within this, where we're going to again create an iterator using this range function and for the column number. Once we have this, we're going to do the simple process of multiplying the value of the element based on its position. So if it's at the position 3, 4, we're going to store the value 3 times 4 into that particular position of the array. And we're going to do this for every position, which is what happens in these two for loops. We're going to first go by each row, and then within that we're going to check each column, and we're going to perform these calculations. And finally we print our result. So let's look at an example. Now I'm going to say I want a 3 by, let's say a 2 by 4 matrix. So let's see what the results will be when I give this as, so what I'm saying is I want 2 rows and 4 columns. Now as you can see here, it might not be very clear to you right now, but what you can see here is this is the first row and this is the second row, and each row contains 4 columns. So this is my final array that I get. So what you can see here is this is the 0th position, and the or you can say this is the first row, first column, first row, second column. And since Python is 0 based, so this is actually the 0th row and this is the first row. So as you can see, this value basically is 0 times 1. This value is 0 times 2, 0 times 3, 0 times 4. And over here it is 1 times 0, 1 times 1, 1 times 2, 1 times 3. So similarly, if I did, for example, a 5 by 5 matrix, what you will get is 5 rows now, 5 rows and 5 columns. And for example, like this particular value is 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2, 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3 and the first column. So this is 3 times 1. If I took this value, this is like the 4th row, for example. 4th row times the 0, 1, 2, 3, third column. So this would be 4 times 3, which is 12. So, and each value of this has been generated in the similar process. So this is an example of how we can use for loops for a particular exercise that I have shown you right now. So this was it for these particular examples into while and for loops. I hope you found the 2 examples on while loops and this 1 example on for loops helpful to you. And I hope it gave you further insight into how we can use these types of loops in say different projects. Once again, if you enjoyed this video and you learned from this content, please do share, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.